You need to unmute. We can't hear you, but we can see your PPT.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
And you can see the screen.
Screen, yeah, abstract labor is what we can see.
Yes. Wait.
Okay. Yeah. Wait, yeah.
Good. So these are two lectures on the first chapter. Capital, the book for which Marx is probably the most famous. The volume 1, which is what we will be reading, was published in 1867. Volumes 2, this was of course in Marx's lifetime. Marx published the book in 87. Volumes 2 and 3 were in manuscript stage, and Marx never agreed to publish them in his lifetime. They were published after his death by his friend Friedrich Engels in 1883, volumes 2 and 3. And then subsequently, there were a whole set of notes that Marx notes, along with remarks, his own comments and so on, that Marx made on the various political economy writers that Marx read through that entire period when he was working on this book. And those notes were later again published by Engels under the title Theories of Surplus Value. They're available in 3 volumes. Those are Marx's notes on his readings. As it says on the title page, Capital is a critique of political economy. Those two terms require a little bit of explanation. First of all, political economy was an entire discipline which emerges, one might say, from the 18th century. You may know of economic theories such as mercantilism or physiocracy. Mercantilism is actually understood as a theory which was very directly concerned with the policies of the state, because mercantilism was particularly in vogue in the 17th century, especially under the absolute monarchies in France, in England. And mercantilism basically was a theory which said that the wealth of a nation depended on the wealth that was in the treasury, as it were. All right? Wealth was acquired through trade. The wealth of a nation was acquired through trade, and the objective of trade was to accumulate as much wealth from others as possible. And so mercantilism depended very much on state policies which imposed customs duties on various imports from other countries, and which facilitated the selling or trading in the nation's own products. So the entire policy was directed towards increasing the wealth in the treasury. And in some ways, the whole measure was reduced almost to the amount of gold and silver and other treasures that accumulated in the royal treasury. So that was sort of the first sense in which an idea of political economy developed. This was soon shown to be a completely fallacious argument, especially later on. Adam Smith completely demolished this theory and argued that this was no way in which a nation's wealth would increase. It simply increased the quantity of gold and silver in the royal treasury. That was not wealth of the nation. And the second major stream of thought, which largely, again, began in the 70s, but largely 18th century, which was called physiocracy, and which basically argued that the wealth of a nation was in the products of the land. So it was very largely directed towards agriculture and the cultivation of the land and how much was produced from the land. This was seen to increase the value of the land. So you can see in some ways, of course, the mercantilist theories were very largely connected to the overseas trading nations, the nations which traded with the rest of the world. And of course, mercantilism was emerged in a period when the various riches of the Americas had been discovered. So Spain, for instance, all the Spanish colonies, and gold and silver and all kinds of minerals were imported from South America. And that contributed immensely to the idea of the wealth of the country increasing, because so much gold and silver was coming in from the Americas. But with the idea of physiocracy and the concentration on the land, you can see that this was much more a continental idea, an idea which emerges in countries which don't necessarily have huge trading networks, overseas trade, but which have very large land resources. And that became the focus of physiocracy. That also is a very important strand of thought which enters into what would be called political economy in the 19th century. In 19th century political economy, especially after Adam Smith in the late 18th century, and then David Ricardo in the early 19th century, these are the people who were immediate predecessors of Marx. And this is largely the literature which had almost established itself under the name of political economy. By the early 19th century, you actually have chairs in various universities called a chair in political economy. It becomes a kind of recognized academic discipline by then. And this is the literature that Marx was examining through what he called critique. Now, critique does not necessarily mean criticism. Critique has a very specific philosophical meaning. It emerges, of course, through the German philosophers. Kant, for instance, the three major books by Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment. These are the three major philosophical books by Immanuel Kant. And that, in a sense, lays down the method of the critique, which is not simply to dismiss something as being wrong. The critique considers the origins, the conditions, and conditions of possibility, and the limits of a particular field of knowledge or a particular discipline. So it actually examines so a critique of political economy would mean, where does this discipline or the ideas of political economy emerge? How does it emerge? Where does it come from? What are the conditions that make it possible for that kind of thinking to emerge? So, for instance, in Marx, you will often have references to a particular idea in political economy, and Marx will say, and we will encounter this even in this chapter, and Marx would say, this idea could never have emerged in classical Greece. It could never have emerged in medieval France, in medieval Europe, because in fact the conditions, the social conditions, were not conducive for an idea like this to emerge. Okay, so that is a very important aspect of what is being called the method of critique. And finally, the limits of that discipline or those ideas. So first of all, so therefore, the conditions of possibility and the limits. The limits being, what are the terms that are set by that particular discourse in that discipline, which cannot go beyond a certain point, or which puts certain limits to what it can think about. It cannot think beyond it, given the terms of that particular discipline. And so critique of political economy involves all of these three things. And this is what Marx is attempting in Capital. He will explain where the concepts or categories, as he calls it, categories of political economy, or sometimes he simply calls it bourgeois economy. Where do they come from? What are the conditions that make those categories thinkable? And what are the limits of those categories? What are the problems it cannot? What are the problems, in a sense, and this is what he'll show, what are the problems that this kind of thinking creates and is unable to resolve? Okay, so that is what critique is. Finally, it's a study of the sphere of civil society in the era of capitalist production. Again, the two terms, civil society and capitalist production, both of those things may be clarified. The era of capitalist production, of course, Marx will explain what capitalist production is. He will make the clear distinctions between the stages of production that emerge or that existed before capitalist production became possible. So there was, for instance, merchants' capital, the trading, as I explained, for instance, mercantilism, the kind of activities of overseas trading nations, the activities of merchants. Now that itself, that creates capital, by the way, because that creates, the merchants actually accumulated wealth. But that was not capitalist production. Okay, you have earlier, of course, you have agrarian production, peasant production of different kinds, which could be purely some kind of collective common exchange of independent peasant producers, or more generally in large agrarian societies, they were usually under some kind of conditions of servitude or bondage or dependence, which is broadly speaking called feudalism. So you have those who claimed ownership of title over the land, and others were the cultivators, and there was a relationship of dependence between the tenant, usually tenant who were peasants, and landlords. So, in Europe, medieval Europe, there were feudal lords. So, but that is not capitalist production. Capitalist production proper, as Marx will explain in this book in particular, in great detail, is when you actually have, and we will look at the basic condition that will make it possible. This is when you have a class of people who have the capital, that is to say, they have the wealth to invest in raw materials and the means of production. The means of production in capitalist economies usually involves machines, technologies of some kind, right? So you need capitalists. They will be called capitalists who will invest, who will set up a what would be called the factory. Will be set up a factory with machines. He will buy the raw materials, and then what he will need is to find those who will work in that factory as wage laborers. That is to say, he will pay wages to workers who will come and work on those machines, and the product will belong to the capitalist. So the workers will be paid their wages, right? The capitalist will own whatever is produced, which the capitalist will then sell in the market and hopefully recover all the costs of production plus earn a profit. Now, that specifically is capitalist production. And as Marx will explain, that this kind of capitalist production on a general scale, right, something that will become the predominant mode of production in society, can only emerge under very specific historical conditions. You will not find that kind of production in earlier stages of history. Marx, of course, as we know, has this whole theory of stages of history. We'll come to that in a minute. Civil society is a very key concept. It is a concept which, at least in the way in which Marx uses the term, comes from Hegel. Hegel, of course, as you know, is the direct, you might say almost the teacher, although Marx was never personally taught by Hegel, but intellectually, Marx and Engels and that generation of people who were called young Hegelians or left Hegelians, they were greatly influenced by Hegel's analysis of modern society. Is the idea of the stages of history also, broadly speaking, come from Hegel. In Hegel, civil society specifically is what Hegel calls the system of needs. That is to say, civil society is that domain of social life where men, and of course I'm using men quite deliberately, I'll explain why, where men associate with one another in order to satisfy their needs. Okay, so this is very largely in Hegel. Civil society is precisely that domain where people engage in trade, where they produce things, go to the market, sell their things, find whatever they need and buy those things, right? So they form associations. This is an entire domain of associational life in society. Very specifically, associations have a very important meaning here, because it implies that there are individuals who own property, individuals who have things which they own, right? These things which they own, they are free to enter into contracts with other people who also own things, also own property. And so they engage in specific contractual relations. So what we do when we go shopping, for instance, it is a contractual relation in the sense we assume that the person who is selling the thing has the right to sell that thing. He's not selling stolen goods, for instance, right? I have to be pretty much certain that what I'm buying is not a stolen good, because in that case, I become liable for possessing a stolen good, right? So when I go shopping, I assume, and this is why the sphere of civil society is important, people have to trust that there are mechanisms in this civil society which make sure that those who are selling things so you have licenses of shops. So this is the domain of civil society, right? This is where, or for instance, markets have associations of those who sell, of shopkeepers, of shop owners. They have their own associations which regulate what is being sold, which also regulate, for instance, there are enormous numbers of things which we take for granted. For instance, things like weights and measures. What are the standard weights and measures? When somebody is selling me a kilo of whatever, right? How do I make sure? Or for instance, when I buy a packet of something which says, 500 grams of something, how can I make sure that that is actually 500 grams, right? Now, that is on trust. Why do I take it on trust? Because I assume that this is precisely what civil society means, that there is a domain of civil life or civic life, right, which is regulated by associations, by my associations, right? The way in which I engage in contractual relations with others, they are through contracts. So if some shop owner is found to be cheating on weights, for instance, right, that shop owner is violating several contractual obligations to the market owners, contractual obligations to his customers, and of course there may well be criminal liabilities also. And that is where the state also comes in, because one of the key guarantees that this sphere of civil society will operate satisfactorily is that the state will guarantee that contracts are maintained, that people observe the conditions of contracts. If contracts are violated, then you have the courts of the state, courts of law. You can go to court to say this contract has been violated. So the sphere of civil society is essentially the sphere of these contractual associational relations between um, between individuals in society. There's also an important assumption here. It's not an assumption in Hegel. Hegel explains all this very clearly. There are three domains here, and Marx basically follows that division. There is family, there is civil society, and there is the state, right? The family is not a part of civil society in Hegel. And to some extent, you will find that assumption being carried on in Marx as well, at least as far as his discussion of bourgeois society and certainly pre-capitalist society is concerned. Because in Hegel, the family is not formed through contract. It's a very interesting argument, because later on, this is not what would normally be assumed, because as we know, the general understanding today, for instance, in civil law, is that a marriage is a contract. And it's a contract between, most of the time, a man and a wife. Of course, you have now that definition has been extended to same-sex marriages and so on. But um, but a contractual obligation, but that is not how. So therefore, in that sense, if you follow Hegel's definition, the family would be part of civil society, because family can be dissolved. It's an association. There are rights that husbands have towards the wife, and wives have in relation to their husbands. Children have rights. So those kinds of things don't exist in Hegel's system, right? In Hegel, a family is formed through what Hegel calls, very interestingly, he calls love. And love actually means a complete surrender of rights. So in Hegel, the family is formed when a man and a woman decide to come together and completely surrender their rights vis-a-vis one another, each other, right? They don't have rights. So in a family, within a family, the husband does not have rights against the wife does not have rights against the husband. That is the family. The family is represented in civil society through the head of the family, who of course by definition is male, right? And hence civil society is an association of the heads of families, right? So the families are subsumed at a level which is subordinate to the family, right? Within the family, there is no associational life. Okay, and that is the understanding, broadly speaking, that you find carried on in most of Marx. He doesn't go into this in great detail, as far as I know. So that is civil society then. And then you have the state, which of course is the domain where law is made, laws that regulate civil society. That, of course, is the political domain of the state. So uh, with that, let's move to the main text. Now, one thing let me also point out that the text which has been circulated to you is the 1976 English translation, the Penguin translation, which is, of course, which is a modern translation. The text that I used and that I studied at great length was an older text. It's the older translation, which was 1886 by Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling. And that is the text that I read, and I still have a very, very heavily marked annotated copy, which I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Yes, this is the Moscow edition of Capital, which I use. And as you can see, some of these pages are very heavily marked and annotated. I don't know if you can see it. So that's the book I prefer to use. Anyway, so sometimes at some places, the text that I will read may be a little different from the one you have in front of you, if you have the text in front of you. But it's not a huge difference. Okay. So the very first sentence of this chapter, the first chapter, which is called the commodity. In my translation, it says commodities. Anyway, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Okay, what does that mean? And why does, so our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. Now, why does Marx begin there? So speaking about capitalist production, why do you begin with commodities? And this is again a very important part of, you might say, the Hegelian method. The Hegelian method, you begin with what is called the immediate world as it appears, right? Before you begin thinking or reflecting on the world, right? That is where investigation must begin. You begin with the immediate world as it appears without any mediation. Immediate actually means without mediation. There is nothing that mediates. Okay? Now, what does that mean? It means that when you think of capitalism or capitalist production, right, don't immediately think of capital, because capital is not immediately in front of you, right? Don't think of profit. It's not immediately in front of you. Don't think of any of those kinds of things which are conceptual, right? Before you go into concepts, begin from what is immediately in front of you, appears in front of you. It is appearance, right? And in capitalist society, wealth appears appears as an immense collection of commodities. So, for instance, you can understand that this is actually a very common way of perceiving wealth. You go to a rich country, or you see pictures of a rich country. How do you decide that this is a rich country compared to a poor country? and you decide in terms of commodities, commodities that you see. So you see all these glittering shop windows with all kinds of things that are up for sale, right? And you compare another country where you have very ordinary, mundane things on sale, right? That is where you make the, now this is not mediated. You are not making any great, exercises of conceptual thinking here. Before you do any of this, you begin there. Critique begins with the immediate phenomenon, the elementary appearance before mediations. Before you begin to mediate by through conceptual thinking, right? What is immediate element, that is what is elementary. Okay. What is it then? Now you are beginning mediations. You are beginning to analyze this thing which is in front of you, which is the commodity. So think of anything that one buys from the market as a commodity. It has, as Marx says, a use value and an exchange value. Now, a use value is simply the usefulness of a thing. You buy something as a commodity because it is of some use to you, right? It is of some use to you. It is a quality that satisfies some human want or need. I think your translation has need. It is a quality that satisfies some human need. Now, Marx adds here very important addition that what that need is, where that need comes from, is not something we will be concerned with. Why? Let me ask you this, somebody. Just think about this, right? When you buy something, you buy things that will satisfy some need. That's, I want to buy this, right? Marx is saying why you want to buy it. What is the source of this need for you is not something that should concern us when we try and understand the nature of the commodity. Why? Does it matter? Does it matter where this need comes from? Please, somebody respond. I want a brave person who will be the first person to ask her to respond in class. Please unmute yourself and speak. Why do I hear nothing? Well, let me ask you an even more simple question. When somebody buys something which is completely useless, supposing I buy whatever, a pen, which may be the 105th pen that I own. And I know I'm not really going to use it because I have 104 other pens. Now, does it matter in the world of commodities why I feel I need to buy the pen? Doesn't matter.
Are other faculty allowed to venture something since?
Usually,
I mean, I don't know because no one's speaking at all.
all right, all right. You pretend to be a student. Go on.
I am your student, so I just no, I was thinking maybe maybe the sort of the, the desire for the commodity is something that perhaps over a long term sort of influences how the market functions, and the production of the desire is also the part of the of you
No,
know
no, but that is you're moving into an area which says that some kind of need is created, right? A sense of need is created
yes.
by those who produce things. But that is not what Marx is saying. Marx says it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. But maybe somebody is completely a crackpot and buys things which actually any other person would say, but that person doesn't need it. But that person feels that there is some need, right? So what Marx is saying is it makes no difference to the commodity itself, the nature of a commodity, right? Whether or not there is a genuine need, or whether or not somebody actually should need this, right? For instance, there are lots of criticisms of consumerism, for instance, where people will say, well, we don't really need all of these things that we go and buy, okay? And we keep them in there are lots of things we buy and keep at home and really don't use them. Or right now, what Marx is saying, it makes no difference. It makes no difference because as long as there is somebody or the other who thinks that commodity will satisfy some need, and that need may be completely imaginary need, it makes no difference, right? So that is some, because as far as the production of commodities is concerned, or what makes a commodity, it must have some use for some consumer, somebody who is buying it. And it is not a business of political economy. You can make that a question for social psychology, for instance. That's a very different question, right? The social psychologist is not looking into the making of the commodity itself, right? As far as the analysis of commodities is concerned within what is understood as political economy, right? All that is necessary is to establish that a commodity satisfies some human need, whatever that need might be. Okay. Now, that is what constitutes the use value of a thing. The use values will consist of both natural elements, that is to say, the elements from nature out of which that commodity is made, right? And plus the labor that is spent in producing the thing. So there is I'm sitting on a chair, right? The chair is made of wood, which is a natural element. That is what constitutes part of the usefulness of the chair. It also, and then there is labor spent in producing the thing. So the carpenter who made the chair has to make it in a particular form or shape that makes it useful. So you can sit on it, right? Those are the two parts of use values. It consists of natural elements which make it useful, and it. So, for instance, if the chair was made from wood that was maybe rotten, a rotten wood, then the natural elements would be something that would be much less useful than required. And generally speaking, I would not buy a chair which I knew was made of rotten wood and would not last very long. Maybe it, It would probably break the first time I sat on it. So those are the two parts of what is called use value. Now, there's another aspect of value, of the value of a thing, which is exchange value. And that is a purely quantitative relation. This is also a very important distinction here. The use value relates to the quality of a thing. What is its use, right? Is a qualitative thing. So as I just explained about the chair, it's the qualitative part which makes it useful. But then there is exchange value, which is the quantitative relation in which things exchange. And that appears to be accidental. Why? Why is it accidental? Because when one buys things, right, the exchange value, which normally speaking we would call a price at which we buy or sell, that for the same commodity can fluctuate, it can vary, as we know, that prices vary for the same thing. Something costs, as you know, for instance, fruits may cost a particular, maybe cheaper in one season and expensive in another season. They depend on all sorts of what appears to be accidental circumstances. So it depends on seasons, it depends on supplies, it depends on a whole range of other things. The natural properties of a thing have nothing to do with its exchange value. This is a very important distinction that Marx is already making. Whereas the use value has something to do with its natural property, right? Is it useful or not? So when I'm buying something, I am actually considering its use value when I make a judgment as to whether or not it will satisfy my need. But when I decide on the price, or when the seller and the buyer agree on a price, right? That has nothing to do with the natural property, precisely because, as I just said, that prices can vary without the natural qualities changing at all. So the same, apple or the same orange, right, can cost, that's to say, can have different exchange values depending on all sorts of things, but without any change in the natural property. So that is a crucial distinction here.
Sir, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I have a question here, sir. You just mentioned that in the context of an exchange value, the natural properties of a thing have nothing to do with it. But what happens when we are thinking of buying a diamond or gold jewelry? Because then the price of that commodity or product is directly determined by how valuable or how scarce or the method by which the thing was procured. So how is that?
Again, apply the same distinction. The diamond, when you buy it, it has some use value for you, right? Because it will look a particular way. You want to set it in a piece of jewelry. You want to display it and announce to the rest of the world how wealthy you are. It can be all kinds of things. That is the use value, okay? But the exchange value, the price, will depend not on this, because that same diamond can cost different things in different markets, right? That same diamond, depending on supplies, depending on, and of course, when you have these fancy things which are very scarce, right? The exchange value is truly accidental, because many of these things could be sold off by auction, for instance, which is a completely on-the-spot kind of agreement between buyer and seller, or several sellers, buyers, potential buyers are bidding for a particular thing. So again, the distinction is precisely this, that the natural property concerns the usefulness of a thing for a particular consumer, right? Whereas the exchange value depends on what we will see is a contractual agreement in the market. Okay. Now turning to how commodities are made or produced. And here again, you begin with the most immediate element that appears. How are things made? And they are made by what Marx is calling concrete labor. The concrete labor that goes into the making of a particular thing cannot be compared with any other concrete labor. Now, what does that mean? Again, go back to this chair that I'm sitting on. It is made of wood. So the concrete labor is the labor of the carpenter who made this chair. This chair, incidentally, is older than me. So it was probably made some 80 or 90 years ago. I don't know when. But anyway, so you can at least see that the carpenter must have been pretty good. And the natural properties were also very good of the wood. But this particular concrete labor cannot be compared with, let us say, this laptop that is also in front of me. It's also a commodity, right? Also made by labor. But that labor is of a completely different kind. It was probably not made by one person at all. It was various parts were made separately by various groups of workers, maybe in different countries, we don't know, right? And then they were all assembled together by another set of workers in some assembling factory. And then it was put out in the market from where I bought it. Now, the concrete labors simply cannot be compared. How would you compare which required more labor, which required less labor, right? What was the value of those labors? None of this can be compared. Because in the concrete, right, once again, you are actually looking at the quality of the labor. What is the qualitative aspect of that labor? Things like skill, things like training, those kinds of things will go into the concrete labor that goes into the making of a particular thing. And therefore, when you compare things as commodities, right? When you compare things as commodities, where a chair is a commodity, the laptop is a commodity, the pen is a commodity, the book in its physical form is also a commodity, right? They are made of very, very different kinds of concrete labor. And so they simply cannot be compared. And yet, we exchange. Things exchange. So think of, and we will come to this in a minute, don't think of prices in terms of money, but simply think of a barter exchange. A barter exchange. That is to say, somebody has grown, let us say, rice in his field, and somebody has woven cloth with a loom. Okay, think of a village economy where there is no money. So the person who has grown rice, paddy in his field, right, needs cloth, which he has not produced. And the weaver has produced cloth, but he also needs food or rice, which he has not produced. So what do? They come to the market, okay? And in the market, the weaver finds the farmer and they exchange. They agree, they decide on some kind of exchange. They say, all right, I will give you so many yards of cloth. You give me so much rice. Now that is an exchange. Okay? But in that exchange, the concrete form of the labor of the weaver and the farmer have disappeared. Because they are not comparing concrete labor there. So when the weaver is selling the cloth, right, in exchange for cloth, in exchange for rice, okay, he is not comparing the concrete work of a weaver with the concrete work of a farmer, because they cannot be compared. But they compare something. They must compare something, otherwise how do they exchange? How do they agree, let us say, that maybe, 2 saris is equal to whatever, 10 kilos of rice. How do they come to that agreement? Something has been compared. And this is a very key move that Marx is making. So what is compared is human labor in the abstract. In the abstract. So something has to be abstracted out of those concrete labors. So basically, when the farmer and the weaver exchange, the weaver does have some conception of how much work it took to produce 2 saris, right? And whether that amount of work will be compensated in his mind, okay, will be compensated by 10 kilos of rice. And similarly, the farmer also has some notion of how much work it took to produce 10 kilos of rice, and whether or not that is really worth 2 saris, right? Once they have both arrived at that judgment that yes, we are so what are they actually comparing? They are comparing human labor in the abstract. There is some abstraction which is implicitly made. They may not be doing this consciously, right? But this is precise. So it is no more immediate anymore. We have moved away from immediacy. We are now beginning to see the mediations going on. And the mediation is that they have agreed on that exchange, because they are equalizing human labor in the abstract. Certain amount of human labor in the abstract. So whether it is weavers or farmers makes no difference, right? Whether it's the labor of the weaver or the labor of the farmer, there is some abstract quantity of labor which has been equalized. So they have both decided that this exchange is good for me as well as good for the other person, because we have exchanged equal amounts of things. What is that equal amount of things? We have exchanged equal amounts of labor in the abstract, right? Now, we have not brought in money because, as we will see, that will require a further level of mediation when you work through money. Let us assume that there is no money and yet there is exchange. And that is where you first begin to make the argument about what Marx will call abstract labor. Human labor in the abstract, which is abstracted out of every concrete kinds of labor. The concrete kinds of labor of, let us say, the carpenter or the weaver or the farmer and so on. Okay. So, abstract labor. It is identical human labor power. Labor power. This is a new term that will be very important, right? Labor power. It is not labor, because in labor, you already have the concrete and the abstract, which are mixed up. Because labor immediately, in the immediate sense, is concrete labor. It's carpenter's labor, weaver's labor, farmer's labor, etc. Right? But the abstract, what is abstracted out, is labor power. Labor power, which is what constitutes every concrete labor. Every concrete labor is constituted by a certain amount of abstract labor power, right? That is what is the common measure now. We will come to this in a minute. And that common measure is the socially average unit. Now, the socially average, this is again a conceptual assumption that Marx will have to make. It is average. Why is it average? Because let us say you take weaving, for instance. Okay. Now, you may have good weavers, skilled weavers, and you may have poor weavers, right? Now, so between two weavers, you can have one weaver who can make, let us say, one sari in 2 days, and another who takes 5 days to make a sari, the same sari. Now, does that mean, now in terms of concrete labor, obviously, the slow weaver has put in much more labor, right? In concrete terms, right? He has put in much more labor. But does that mean that when that sari is to be exchanged, the bad weaver will say, oh, I have spent so much labor in this, so I will not exchange this for 5 kilos of rice, I will need 20 kilos of rice. Is that a valid exchange? Just think of it. Think of what would happen, let's say, if poor weavers were to ask for a higher price for their commodities because they have spent more labor on it. Would I be prepared to pay that higher price simply because the weaver is a bad one? No, obviously not, right? Because if I know that there are good weavers, right, who will take much less time and are prepared to sell that sari for so much, why should I go to a bad weaver and pay more? Makes no sense, right? So what is actually the valid exchange, or the exchange that people will agree? And this is what Marx is calling the socially average unit. So weaving, for instance, right? Weaving as a profession, as a branch of labor, as a branch of concrete labor, right? Weaving will have a socially average measure of how much labor it should take to make a sari. And that is what will prevail in the exchange. When in an exchange in the marketplace, right, we come to an agreement by equalizing human labor power. That labor power is what is the socially average unit, right? So here, the only level of skill which matters is the socially average level of skill. Okay, so which effectively means that in fact, since the socially average level will prevail, a skillful weaver who can weave the sari quicker than others will actually make a profit or will actually earn more than the poor weaver. You see that? Will actually earn more than a poor weaver, because if the socially average is one sari, let's say, we're just assuming, one sari in 2 days, and there is a particularly skilled weaver who can make one sari in 1 day, right? Then in terms of the socially average, he can make 2 saris in the average time that other weavers will take. So in fact, he will be able to sell 2 saris.
Sir,
Yes,
I just had one question.
yes.
Can you please explain how the duration of labor kind of relates to the quantity of labor? As in,
Yeah.
if the product...
Again, no, that's a good question, because again, go back to the idea of the abstract labor power, human labor power, right? We are not dealing here with the concrete labor, right? The time is the only measure by which you are now measuring different quantities of labor power. You are assuming that the labor power, every unit is the same. So whether it is the carpenter or good carpenters and bad carpenters, right? The unit is the same, which is the socially average unit. What is the quantity then? You are measuring quantity in terms of the labor time, right? Because you are assuming that in every unit of time, the labor power that is expended is the same everywhere, because that is the socially average. Understood? So,
Yes, thank you, sir.
yeah. So that is the socially average unit. Now, therefore, when you are thinking of a commodity, okay, then you will define and this is will be the next step, which he will call value, the value of a commodity, as distinct from the use value and the exchange value, right? So this is the third concept, which actually encapsulates all of these things together. And that is measured by socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary labor time, it's a very crucial definition. What is that? It is that required to produce any use value under normal conditions of production with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent in a given society. Okay, now Marx has summarized all of the arguments so far. Okay, what is the value of a commodity? Value of a commodity consists of both use value and exchange value. Okay, those are two aspects. How do you measure value of a commodity? You will measure the value in terms of the socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary meaning, again, it is what is the accepted average degree of skill and intensity prevalent in a given society. Socially necessary labor time is that required to produce any use value under normal conditions of production with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent in a given society. Now Marx will consider how this socially necessary labor time or value, right, can increase or decrease. Okay, and that will depend upon this normal conditions of production. If conditions of production change, right, or the average degree of skill and intensity change, then socially necessary labor time could also change, and the value of commodities could also change. Okay. So this is the definition of value. Value of a commodity is the socially necessary labor time required for its production. Socially necessary labor time has already been defined. It is the average, socially average time required under normal conditions of production. Okay, so that is the value of a commodity. And this is the crucial definition that Marx is offering. It is the socially necessary labor time required for its production. Improvement in productivity of labor brings down the labor time necessary for its production. Things become cheaper, that is, their values are reduced. Now, this is a very interesting concept, and some may think it's not very obvious. So what Marx is saying is that if techniques of production improve, that is to say, let's say new machines are invented, new processes are invented, all right? Then what happens is labor becomes more productive. What does that mean? That labor is able to produce more value in less time. If that happens, it means obviously labor time necessary for the production of the thing is reduced. Things become cheaper. That is to say, their values are reduced. Now, you can think of lots of things that have happened in recent times, where because of the improvement in productivity or changes in technology, things have become cheaper. Think of all the electronic things that you use. Think of phones, cameras, laptops, computers, all of these things. Of course, many of you probably haven't been using these things for that long, but even in the last 10 years or 15 years, right, many of these things have become cheaper because, in fact, new technologies have been introduced that make those things cheaper. When things become cheaper, that is actually to say that their values have been reduced. All that means is that the socially necessary labor time required for the production of that thing, of that laptop or the camera or the phone, the value of the commodity has been reduced because the socially necessary labor time required is less. Okay. Now, if you compare, now value, as I said, will have both elements, use value as well as exchange value. Okay. Now, things can have use value without having value, right? And Marx gives the examples of air, virgin soil. You can think of the water of rivers or natural ponds, lakes, for instance, right? Why do they have no value? Tell me, this is an easy question.
Because we do not have to pay for them.
No labor.
Why do we not have to pay for them?
No labor.
Exactly, they have not been produced. They have not been produced by human labor. Air is not produced by human labor. Virgin soil, interestingly, virgin soil is a good example. As soon as that land is worked upon, right, through agricultural techniques, somebody farms that land, then that land becomes a commodity and has value, right? Because labor has been put into it. Okay, water again. water, natural water in the river has no value because it has not been produced by human labor. But as soon as that water is transported, carried, let's say 10 miles, and then sold, it can be sold because labor has been put into that. It has become commodity, right? Labor has been put into it. So things can have use value without having value. Things can have use value and be produced by labor without being a commodity, such as things produced for self-consumption. Okay? So supposing someone farms land and all that is produced is consumed by the farmer's family. Nothing is sold. Then what is being produced, that food crop produced, has no value. It has no value because it is not a commodity. It has been produced, but it is not produced as a commodity. It has not been produced for sale or exchange in the market, right? If it is not produced for exchange in the market, then it does not become a commodity, and therefore it has no value. Okay? Now, nothing can be a value without having use value. Useless things produced by labor are not value. Go back to the discussion we had earlier. It doesn't matter what that use value is, where it comes from, right? But it must have somebody. There must be somebody who has some use for it. If there is something that is produced that nobody has any use for, then that is not a commodity because it's a useless thing. Even though it is produced by labor, it has no value. Okay? Any questions?
Sir, I had one question.
Yes.
I wanted to ask, for instance, if something that is not a commodity, for instance, if we are cooking at home, but we know the market value of the particular dish that would be sold in the market, how would we see that?
I don't understand. Something that, say that again.
Something that we are not putting up for the market, we are just consuming ourselves at home,
Right.
but we know the market value.
Okay. That is not a commodity.
That still won't be a commodity.
No, it's not a commodity. Something is a commodity only when it is in the market or it has been purchased from the market. So for instance, it depends on what you're using. If what you're using at home for consumption is something that has been purchased from the market, of course it has value, right? But one is talking here of something that has been produced by one's own labor, right? And is being used. So therefore it has use value. But since it has no value because it is not a commodity.
Thank you.
Right? Okay. Now, this is where all of these conceptual work that Marx has done, right? All these concepts. So beginning with the immediate appearance of wealth as commodity, beginning from there, Marx is now arrived at what would be for him a key concept in understanding the nature of the commodity, which is the idea of value. Commodities have value, okay? And there is now a very specific argument that will emerge from this. This is a historical argument which will emerge. This is where he will connect what he has said so far with the understanding of capitalist production. Labor as creator of use values exists in all societies, right? So obviously, use values, that is to say things of utility, have been produced by human beings always, from the most earliest sort of hunters gatherers. So when people simply go hunting, right, or they simply gather from the forest, they just get trees, fruits, for instance, from collect fruits from forest trees, right? That requires labor. Okay, so labor as creator of use values exists in all societies. But only in capitalist societies do commodities have value. Okay, so fruits that are collected from nature, right, and consumed, that requires labor, but they have no value, right? So only in capitalist society would things have values. So you could have bread, cheese, all of those things that are shown there in the picture. All of those things could have been made, and they were made in pre-capitalist societies also, right? Pre-capitalist societies also had cheese, they had bread, they had fruits, they had wine. All of those things were made, and they were made by labor. But they only have value, and this is what you see. This is a normal way when if you want cheese or bread, you have to go to a shop and buy it. We don't make it ourselves, right? And that has value because they are produced for exchange in the market, right? So that is the crucial, why value is crucial in terms of understanding the political economy of capital, right? Because what in capitalist production, what are produced are commodities, and they must be commodities which have value. That is to say, they
Excuse
must
me,
be
sir.
so yeah, yes.
Yes, so the value of a commodity is decided by the abstract labor, right?
Yes, the value of commodity has already
How
been defined.
I do not see
It
difference
is
then in the two.
it is the socially necessary labor time required for its production, right? So that is the value. Socially necessary labor time. Now, when if I am making bread from, I mean, not only bread, I am getting the wheat, producing my own wheat, and then making my own bread, right? There is a lot of labor time that will go into it. But there is no socially necessary labor time here. Because how do you know? Right? If everybody is doing the same thing, right? Somebody will do it quicker, somebody will do it, and there is no way of establishing a social average because nothing is being exchanged, right? You can establish the social average only when there is a general practice of exchange of what people produce, because it is through exchange that this socially average labor time or abstract labor is equalized. It is only when they're equalized that you get a sense of what is socially necessary and what is average, right? Now, socially average also means a simple average labor in a particular society at a particular time. And that is given. Marx is making a huge assumption here, because it is an abstraction itself, right? Because this simple average labor in a particular society at a particular time is a given. It is given. How is it given? It is established, Marx is saying, through a generalized system of exchange. That you know what is the average value, the value as average of particular commodities. That is established. People have a sense. Okay. So, for instance, if somebody asked me today for 500 rupees for a piece of loaf of bread, so I will know that is not the average that is established, socially established, because there is only a simple average level of labor that is required to make it. It is socially established. Now, there are obviously kinds of labor which require more skill, higher training, right? Maybe greater levels of education. That is also labor, right? And that Marx is calling complex labor, which is the intensification of simple labor and is equivalent to multiples of simple average labor. So think of a worker in a high technology industry, right? Now that worker is not working according to a simple average labor. Marx is conceptually now, of course, it will depend on lots of things. How much, what would be the, how would you measure the labor time in terms of socially average labor time? How would you measure the labor time that is spent by this high-skilled laborer? So, for instance, what it effectively means is that 1 hour of labor in simple average labor, 1 hour, cannot be equated with 1 hour of very high-skilled labor, right? So 1 hour of high-skilled labor may be 5 times the simple average, simple labor, or 10 times simple labor. But it is a multiple, right? Which is therefore, these are all simplifying assumptions that are being made in order to basically analyze the nature of capitalist production. So this is the distinction between simple and complex labor. Now we are coming to the crucial section on how values are established through exchange. How are values actually, how is this socially average established? How do people know that this is the social average? And this is a whole procedure. Historically, of course, it takes long time to be established. There are lots of, so people who know a little bit of economic history will immediately be able to say, one of the obvious things is that if everywhere in a particular region, right, if everywhere the same average value of things were not only socially established but practiced, right, then clearly what is understood as the basic function of traders would not exist, because traders basically buy cheap in one kind of market and sell at a higher price in another market, right? And if it was simply a matter of transporting, right, then that is not where traders make their profit. They make their profit because prices are different in different markets. That is what traditional traders always did, right? They went and bought things which were available cheaply in some markets and then sold it more at a higher price in another market. But the average actually means that larger and larger areas actually become relatively equalized through continuous exchange. As long as there is a generalized exchange, these things become equalized, right? And this is the process that Marx is now looking into. How is this general exchange, the value established through general exchange, how does that work? Now, this is a slightly long section, and there is a lot of detailed discussion here. Much of it is, I think, unnecessary. Marx was writing at a time when these things required very, very complicated explication. I don't think we need to look into it. It's actually not so difficult. If you read through that section on the accidental form of value, the equivalent value, etc., you can get very confused. But let me explain this in fairly simple terms. It's actually not so difficult. So Marx begins with a very simple exchange, right? Again, this is barter exchange. There is no money involved here. 20 yards of linen is equal to 1 coat. Okay. Now, this may be the result of a particular exchange with no general significance, right? There is, at a particular point of time, somebody brings 20 yards of linen, and let us say somebody has 1 coat, or the linen is turned into 1 coat. That's also possible, right? Made into 1 coat. And that is a particular exchange. At another place, it may be 25 yards of linen. That's a completely different transaction. There is no generalized exchange and no social average established as yet. So this is a single exchange. But in that exchange, there is on the one side a relative value and an equivalent value. That is to say, the linen is relative. You have a relative value for linen because it is equivalent to 1 coat. Okay, so you have a relation here. 20 yards of linen is equal in some sense, some value sense, with 1 coat, because that exchange has taken place. So that is a relative value. They are exchanging at value, right? They are exchanging at the same value. That is a relative value. And there is the coat, which is equivalent to 20 yards of linen. So this is what Marx is calling a relative value on the one side and an equivalent value on the other. Now, if this exchange becomes prevalent, that is to say, over a large area, over many transactions, okay, if this exchange becomes prevalent, then we could say, right, that 40 yards of linen will be equal to 2 coats, 60 yards of linen will be equal to 3 coats, right, and similar multiples, right? Now, this may not be true for a single case. Think of a single transaction. Somebody brings 20 yards of linen, right, and exchanges it for 1 coat. And then I say, well, give me another 20 and I will give you another coat. And that person might say no. He may have his own reasons why he will only exchange 20 yards for 1 coat, but not 40 yards for 2 coats. We don't know, because that is a very particular exchange. It may depend on a particular point of time. A man may need 1 coat. He doesn't need a second coat, right? So he says, no, I may have more linen, but I will not exchange it. Correct? So only when that exchange becomes widely prevalent everywhere in a region, you know that 20 yards is equal to 1 coat, then 40 yards can become 2 coats, etc., etc. Then the coat becomes a measure for the exchange value of linen. So you, in a sense, this exchange value is what we normally call price. Okay? Although price is normally expressed in money form, we still don't have money. But in this kind of economy, right, an economy where linen is exchanged for coats, we could say that the exchange value of linen is 20 yards to a coat. 20 yards, the price of 20 yards of linen is 1 coat. The price of 40 yards is 2 coats. The price of 30 yards will be 1.5 coats, even though that might seem absurd. What is half a coat? But that would be the measure. It becomes the measure, right? Here, concrete labor manifests as abstract labor. Private labor becomes social form of labor. This is the first step that has taken place. Concrete labor manifests itself, it expresses itself. You might say it is even embodied in abstract labor, as abstract labor. Because the coat has become a measure, a general measure for linen, right? So again, as we have seen already before, here the weaver's labor and the tailor's labor, they are not relevant here because they have been equalized in the abstract. So it becomes a social form of labor which is expressed through the coat as a measure. Now, again, be careful. The coat now is no longer seen as the work of a specific concrete work of a tailor. The coat is simply become a measure because I can say 1.5 coats, right? It is important when you see this because when it becomes a measure, its specific use value is of no importance, right? When you say something becomes a measure, then its specific use value is of no importance. Because if it were, then half a coat would make no sense. Well, who would want, there's no use for half a coat. Okay, but as a measure, half a particular measure is something that you understand. It makes sense. Half something, a quarter something, correct? So this is where, and we can easily see why coat will never become a general equivalent for all exchanges, because it would simply make no sense. How would you buy things which are fractions of a coat? Okay, or you cannot carry sort of 5 coats to the market to buy things. So this is where what emerges is a general equivalent. A general equivalent. So a coat will not serve that purpose. What will serve that purpose? And here, of course, there is a very, very large literature, both historical and anthropological, on equivalence. What serves as something like money? So you have shells which work as money. Kodi, for instance, a lot of you would know that. Kodi, which used to work as money, right? General equivalent. So anything could be bought with kodis. And increasingly, of course, the use of relatively precious metals. So you get copper in the form of coins begin to circulate as money. So copper, you get silver, you get gold. Okay. By the time Marx is writing in the late 19th century, gold is recognized as the general equivalent or measure for all commodities. It becomes the money form. Okay. All other, so for instance, by when Marx is writing, you already have what is called a gold standard. The gold standard means whatever is the currency in a particular country. So you have pounds, you have francs, you have even the rupee form by the 19th century under sort of the British colonial authority, the rupee form, they all are related to gold, right? And in fact, even when, and of course, Marx is writing at a time when the currency note has been introduced, it is in use, but not in quite general use. So people were still principally using coins, as including gold coins, which would be ordinarily used for buying, relatively expensive things, but still gold coins. But silver coins certainly were in widespread use. But the standard was gold, okay? And gold becomes the universal or general equivalent value. This is the equivalent value. Instead of the quote in our example, think of when any commodity can be converted into an exchange value measured in terms of gold, some fraction of gold. Okay? And that becomes the money form. Gold has acquired that recognition. Now, gold as money does not have concrete use value as gold. It is simply the general equivalent. So the gold coin has no particular use value. It is simply the store of value. It is simply the measure or equivalent, right? The equivalent by which you can measure any commodity. And this is what we would normally call the price of a thing. A price that is expressed in some currency, but that currency in Marx's time was entirely established by reference to a gold. In fact, technically, the government treasury was supposed to have a stock of gold corresponding to the value of currency notes that it circulated in the market. So technically, the currency notes today don't have it. But if you ever see an old currency note, 19th century currency note certainly did, where, for instance, if it was, then it was the Reserve Bank was set up late 19th century. But some authority, some government authority issuing the note would actually say on it, I promise to pay the bearer the sum of so much in gold. Okay, so if you took a 100 rupee note or a 100 pound note to the bank, then technically you could claim an equivalent in gold, because that was the measure. Of course, that is no longer the case because the gold is no longer seen as a standard. Now, of course, and this is a very interesting, we won't go into this now. Why do we accept just a piece of paper and say this is worth 100 rupees or 500 rupees? Why do we accept it? Let me answer that question. Why do we say that I can take 100 rupees to the market and buy commodities worth 100 rupees? Why would somebody take that piece of paper from me as an equivalent? There is no use value, right? In fact, for a piece of note, you can see it is just a piece of paper, it has absolutely no use value. But why do I accept it? Have you ever thought of it?
Like, could it be because it's accepted by the state and regulated and maintained by the state?
No, you've absolutely got it right. We accept it because it is issued by the state, right? And we have trust in the state. Now, there are often occasions, even in modern economies, when people lose faith in the currency note, right? This happens, for instance, if there is a runaway inflation for some reason, right? So, for instance, when something that should cost 100 rupees suddenly costs 1,000 rupees, right? You have to, you may have even read reports or seen in television news of countries where, because of runaway inflation, to buy a piece of bread, people actually have to carry an entire suitcase full of notes in order to buy a piece of bread. And in situations like that, people lose faith in the currency note. So there are actually occasions, even in recent history. For instance, there was an occasion some 20 years ago, so 15 years ago in Argentina, when there was a similar problem because of its failure to repay the government's failed to repay its loans, right? And the value of the currency, it declined so much that finally people actually were reduced to exchange through barter. So just as the kind of examples we were giving, people would go to the market to buy bread and would exchange it for fruits, or exchange it for matchboxes, all kinds of things. They would simply strike a bargain on the spot exchange. You're back to the kind of primitive economies that, or the very simple examples that we were discussing so far, because there is no general equivalent recognized, socially recognized general equivalent. Okay, so this entire understanding of what is the measure of value, and that phrase, the socially average, the socially necessary labor time, all of those, that term socially necessary, that is crucially dependent upon a set of social practices that are established in an entire region, what today we would call an economy, a defined economy, right? There is a set of social practices which are so widespread and established that people have trust. People have trust. Okay, if that trust did not exist in the general equivalent, right, then you would not have this form of economy. In fact, one of the crucial things, therefore, that Marx is establishing here is how much a level of social practice, generalized social practice, is dependent for the functioning of a capitalist economy. A capitalist economy will require this general money form. Otherwise, it simply would not. An exchange, a barter economy would never produce the kind of capitalist production that we are used to seeing now. Okay, let's stop here today because the next set of discussion concerns a very important and interesting set of remarks that Marx will make, which he's calling the fetishism of commodities. We'll come to that next time, next class. If there are any questions, would you please ask me. Anything that
Excuse me, sir.
remains unclear? Yes, yes,
Yeah, in the first page of this commodities, sixth paragraph,
yes.
the last line is therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it.
Yeah.
I did not quite get it,
So
the
exchange
second
value,
point.
now we've actually said why it is a phenomenal form. Phenomenon, meaning it is an appearance, it appears like that, right? So we've gone through this. So something that is a commodity which you buy from the market or sell in the market, it must have, on the one hand, it must have some use for somebody, which is its use value. Okay. And then you have to find somebody else who has something else that I need. Okay, so that there can be an exchange, right? I have a commodity to sell. I don't think of money yet. Okay, I have something to sell and I want to exchange it for something that I need. So I have to find another person who needs the commodity that I want to sell and who also possesses something which I need and he is prepared to sell. Right? Now, when this happens, there is an exchange value which is established. It's the value at which something has exchanged. But that is phenomenal because, as we've seen, right, it could be immediately, it could simply be an accidental exchange. And the exchange value is accidental. It need not prevail generally. It does not express what Marx is saying is the value of that commodity. So an exchange value is a phenomenal appearance. What lies behind it is value. Okay? Value, which is socially necessary abstract labor or labor time. That is the value. When there is exchange value, that does not express socially necessary labor time. We don't know what the socially necessary labor time is. Right? So therefore, that is phenomenal, or what is appearance, what lies behind it, what in Hegelian terms would be the essence. So there is phenomenon or appearance, and there is an essence, right? And that essence which you don't see, which does not appear, is the socially necessary labor time. Any other question?
So this socially necessary labor time is distinguishable from the product. It's that what he's saying?
It's distinguishable. Well, the product itself is the commodity as a whole, right? What you're looking at
I
is
actually have
value.
problem with this sentence actually, of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it.
From the product, yes. Because, when you're, let's say again, you're buying the chair, okay? The chair is the product. The chair has an exchange value, right? The exchange value is distinguished from the product itself, correct? Because as I said, the exchange value can vary for the same thing. That same chair could be sold at another market for a different price. The exchange value would be different. So the exchange value itself is not the same as the product, right? You see that? Let me go back to this. As you say, it's the sixth. So is this, of course, what is the first sentence of that paragraph?
A given commodity
Right, you've
is a
given
quarter
commodity.
of
Okay,
wheat.
okay, got
The
it.
last sentence.
So therefore, first, this is my translation, the one I have. the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Okay. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. So what is contained in it and what he is hinting at is value, right? Value which he has not yet defined. And exchange value is distinguishable from value. So the it here is not distinguishable from the product. He means exchange value, right? Which is only the mode of expression of something contained in it and yet distinguishable from it. So what is contained in it is value, but exchange value is distinguishable from value. Got it?
Yeah,
Does
thank you,
that
sir.
make sense? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Partha, there is a question on the chat box. Shall I read it out for you? This is
Yes.
Shobik. Yeah. So Sujata is asking, why does the value of something depend on the labor time or on the abstraction of labor required to produce it, rather than the abstraction of need or use of the product? Shall I repeat it again?
It's a good question. The only problem is that you cannot abstract from need, because that is something that is actually external to the nature of the commodity, as Marx has already argued, right? What the need is, where the need comes from, right? Is one need comparable with another need? None of this makes any difference to the commodity nature to the nature of the commodity itself, as sold in the market. Okay, that's the crucial argument. Now you can have an entire discussion of something which may be called a need economy, an economy which is driven by need rather than by labor time, right? Now a need economy will be defined differently, because then you are no longer dealing in commodities. I mean, that's probably the first thing that will appear, that a need economy will not be the exchange of commodities. It will be something else. And yes, in some sense, many pre-capitalist economies were defined in terms of need. We'll come to this when we discuss the fetishism section, because that has a whole historical implication, where Marx actually is making various comments on how the capitalist exchange is different from the way exchange may have operated in earlier kinds of economies, right? And where need may well be a very important determinant of how things are exchanged, right? But that is not the world of commodities. In fact, Marx makes a very interesting sort of abstract example. We'll come to this next time, of a society where there are free individuals. So this is not a feudal society. There is no obligatory payment by anybody. Free individuals, right? All the means of production is collectively owned. The society itself totally, there is no private ownership, right? Everybody works, okay? Everybody works, and there are two ways of doing this. Either everybody works, and in order to satisfy one's own individual needs. Okay, so everybody's individual needs, which may be different, each person's needs may be different, but they're all satisfied, not through exchange, because everything is owned by collectively. So there is some collective principle of distribution. And if you move away from this very abstract situation, there are many pre-capitalist economies where, in fact, labor is collective, where the means of production is collectively owned, and the distribution is, in fact, it can be in terms of some kind of social status, depending on, it can be in terms of some kind of understanding of abilities, and very often in terms of needs. So an understanding that, for instance, somebody, elderly people who are unable to work, but who also have needs, who satisfies that need? Okay, and there is a collective principle by which such people are also provided for. But that would be an economy which is driven, you might say, by need. But there are no commodities in that economy, right? And there is no market exchange. So that is the crucial difference. Marx is beginning, don't forget, you're beginning with commodities. So the question of need is immediately ruled out. I mean, one of the first 2 or 3 steps that Marx takes. He rules out the nature of the need. There is no critique of need. Okay? All right.
Yes. Sorry, Partha, there is an add-on question. I think you've addressed it, but I'll still read it out because I do think you've addressed it already, but she's put it in there. Why would something be produced by labor in the first place if it was not needed or did not have use to anyone? I think you've already addressed it, but just write it out. So, okay.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? Because then I need to do some other completely routine labor on my part, which is check attendance. All right. So I don't have a list of participants, or do I? Let me just see. Okay. Yes, I do. Okay. So
there's a question in the YouTube channel. Would you want to address it?
Why don't you?
Yeah, I'll just read it out. So this is, there are actually 2 questions, couple of questions. The first one is, Professor Chatterjee, you said that only in capitalist mode of production, a commodity has value. This is from the reading of Marx. Then how can we explain the exchange relations existing in pre-capitalist societies? In pre-capitalist societies. Yeah.
So again, go back to the step-by-step definition. In pre-capitalist societies, there is exchange, and there is some kind of exchange value. Okay, so and this is the crucial difference. There is no generalized exchange. Exchanges can take place and remain at what is called the accidental form of value. That is to say, there are agreements between one buyer and one seller. Okay, and that does not have to be the prevailing social practice where some particular commodity exchanges only at a particular exchange value all across an entire society. That does not appear. That can only appear when there is what Marx will call generalized commodity exchange. Everything exchanges as commodities. Okay, and so in pre-capitalist societies, you can have exchange, right? But that still does not become commodity because it has not been produced for generalized exchange where all needs are satisfied by exchange, right? That's the key difference.
So a relative question.
Yes.
A relative question. I think the next person has asked, if all commodities have value through exchange, then does the possibility of commodities having value exist in non-capitalist societies as well?
Just a minute, say that again.
If all commodities have value through exchange, then does the possibility of commodities having value exist in non-capitalist societies as well?
No, I've just explained that.
Yeah.
Because it cannot. It's only when there is generalized commodity exchange. Everything that is produced is for exchange, right? People don't simply decide to exchange some part of something that they have produced and have to find somebody else who has produced something else that I need, right? Those are the accidental forms of market exchange, which can, of course, exist in any society, right? But what value, as I've said, this is what Marx's key argument is. Commodities have value only in capitalist societies, because this is the only or the first society in history where there is generalized commodity exchange. Everything exchanges as commodities. Okay, and only then can something have value. You see, generally speaking, when one speaks of value, one, the ordinary understanding of value conflates it with something like wealth, something like riches, something like price, something like utility. All of these things are sort of part of what our ordinary understanding of value is. What Marx is trying to argue is that value in the political economy sense, in the specific sense in which value has to be thought of in capitalist economies, is not something which is a matter of appearance. Value does not appear. Value is not a phenomenon. Value lies behind appearances. Value has to be, you can find value or you can discover value precisely through critique. It's through critique of the phenomenon, what appears, what immediately appears, which is commodities. You have to look behind commodities or look into commodities in order to discover value. Okay, don't just leave now. I think I can find, I found Avhana, I found.
Yes.
Partha, I will just end the YouTube live stream right now.
Okay.
So, yeah.
The students, please don't leave yet. I will just check this. So I've got Avhana, I've got Chayona, Mahua Sarkar.